Hey, good morning. It's Patricia Murphy. It's Monday again. This is Seattle Now. Add another item to the list of things making it hard to be Sound Transit. Not enough people are paying to ride. And it's happening just as the agency is about to put less emphasis on making sure that you do. We'll get the details from Seattle Times transportation reporter David Kroman in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. A Washington state trooper who spoke out against Governor Inslee's vaccination mandate has died from COVID. Trooper Robert LeMay's social media went viral in October for making a show of his stance against Inslee's requirement that all state employees get their shot or lose their job. He chose an early retirement instead. LeMay joined the State Patrol in 1999 and served for more than 20 years. He was 50 years old. Speaking of Governor Inslee, his colleagues in Olympia will be talking about him today. Specifically, they'll be talking about taking back those emergency powers he's had since the start of the pandemic. State lawmakers will hold a hearing today on a bill from Republicans that would limit a state of emergency to 60 days unless the legislature okays going any longer. Our colleague Austin Jenkins says more than 5,000 people logged on to a similar hearing on Friday. And one of the Northwest's biggest soccer talents is getting a big honor. The Reign announced yesterday that former goalkeeper Hope Solo will be inducted into the National Soccer Hall of Fame this spring. The Richland-born former Husky went on to become an Olympic gold medalist and World Cup champion. She'll be inducted with the class of 2022 in May. Sound Transit is already under pressure from rising costs and the pandemic. Last week, their outgoing CEO added a new one. Not enough people are paying to ride, and it could put a crimp in things. Not great news for a massive public transportation agency with promises to keep and plans to expand in 3 counties. David Kroman is here. He covers transportation at the Seattle Times. Good to talk to you, David.
Good to talk to you.
So CEO Peter Rogoff is on his way out. He'll be leaving this spring, but he's warning about money problems for his successor at Sound Transit. What's he saying?
Well, we know that all transit agencies are struggling with fare collection. So what we're really talking about is fare collection here, how much money the agency is bringing in from people paying to ride their trains and their buses. And this is an issue for all transit agencies right now, just because not as many people are riding trains and buses. But what Peter Rogoff is saying is that they have this sort of unique problem where the people who are riding are doing so without paying in advance.
All right, so ridership is down, but also people not bothering to pay on their way in. Do we know why people don't pay? Is there good information about fare evasion?
There's a few possible reasons. I think the main one is that they aren't issuing citations right now. For months and months, Sound Transit just didn't have anybody going on the trains, checking, doing the thing where they, ask for your Orca card or receipt of the ticket that you bought. They weren't doing that for months and months. They've started to introduce these, quote, fare ambassadors who will ask you for proof of payment but are not issuing citations. And so, Rogoff is saying that basically people are not worried about being caught right now, and that is spurring people to maybe not pay as much.
And this is further complicated by the fact that, statistically speaking, fare enforcement is racially disproportionate against people of color. And I wonder how they're thinking about potentially remedying this.
Right. There's sort of 2 things going on here at the same time, which is one, dealing with the pandemic, and that is obviously a big deal. But the other, which they had started grappling with even before the pandemic, is exactly what you said, which is figuring out how to create a fare enforcement system that does not land so hard on people of color, which statistics show pretty clearly that riders of color make up a much, much higher percentage of those who receive citations, and even a higher percentage of those who, end up with a misdemeanor for not paying. And so Sound Transit, part of its pullback on enforcement lately is to examine what's going on here and try and figure out a better system to do that. But, as they do that, it's now coming up against this other pressure that they're feeling to bring back enforcement because they are feeling the financial crunch of not bringing in ticket revenue.
And there's a court case that could have an impact here as well. A guy in Snohomish County says it was a violation of his constitutional rights when he was asked to prove he paid for his bus ride in Everett. The state Supreme Court is going to have a look at this and decide whether or not it's even constitutional to ask people whether or not they have paid the fare.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think a detail that's important to point out is, on most buses, when people get on a bus, you either you walk through the front door and then you put your ticket in, and that is how you pay your fare. But on Sound Transit, especially Link Light Rail or some kind of rapid rides, you pay in advance and then are sort of, assuming that it is possible that somebody will come and check to make sure that you've paid. But that, of course, doesn't happen 100% of the time. And so this act of somebody coming up and asking you for proof of payment on something like a light rail, these lawyers in Snohomish County are arguing that qualifies as an unconstitutional seizure, an invasion of privacy. That argument has been rejected by all the lower courts, but the fact that the Washington Supreme Court has agreed to hear this case, the Washington Supreme Court has made some pretty sweeping decisions around criminal justice and civil rights in the past. And so it's not out of the question that, using fare enforcement officers to query every rider to make sure that they've actually paid will be found to be illegal and unconstitutional. That could have impacts on an agency like Sound Transit.
It is notable that the Sound Transit light rail stations have no turnstiles, and there is no automatic stop for people who have not paid like there are at other transit systems like in Boston and New York.
Right. I mean, the stations were just never really designed that way. And, that could be an option, I suppose, if they decide that their legal liability is too high. But that would be a really massive investment. And, frankly, we've seen some issues with basic infrastructure in Sound Transit light rail stations with escalators. And this would add more infrastructure that they would have to install and maintain. It is a possible fix, but it would not be an easy or cheap fix to do it that way.
How many paying riders does Sound Transit need to stay on budget? You mentioned pandemic ridership was way down, which is understandable, but where do they need to be to stay on track?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what the raw number is, but and this, these are all fairly squishy numbers, but by their estimate before the pandemic, roughly 3% of riders were evading fares, so they were they were supposed to have paid and they did not. They're pegging that number now. It's a fairly broad range, but they're pegging that number at as much as 30% at this point. And so, I think ideally they would like to see that number get back down to that 3% number. I don't know what that translates to in riders exactly. But, the thing about a transit system like Sound Transit is there's a technical term for this that I'm forgetting right now, but when it operates, it doesn't, the number of passengers does not influence how much it costs to operate. I mean, you can cut back on some rides and run fewer trains to a certain extent, but for the most part, fewer riders does not translate to cheaper operating costs for Sound Transit. And then, even at the same time, some operating costs are actually going up. And so they are feeling like, they have to get people paying kind of back in the same proportion that they were doing pre-pandemic.
All right, let's talk about some solutions to this, possible solutions anyway. Peter Rogoff, he said we need to get back to a time when people honor the honor system. I want to hear that information campaign from Sound Transit. Do the honorable thing. Right, yeah.
So they have two things they have to solve for, as we've discussed, and they are not always compatible, which is the first thing they have to solve for is the disproportionate impact of fare enforcement. And so to address that, they are recommending to the board that they, increase the number of warnings that people receive before they're penalized for not paying, and basically do more education. And instead of citing people to, and then making them pay to the agency, they would basically force them to put money on their Orca cards so that they will pay for future rides and that sort of thing. So that's one thing that they're trying to deal with. But then the other one, of course, is the fact that they don't see as many people paying fares. And so their ultimate goal is to kind of retrain people into the habit of tapping your Orca card before you get on the train. And if that means that they actually lower the cost of certain fares, they are okay with that. One of the recommendations was, you take the youth and subsidized fares from $1.50 down to $1 on the idea that they would prefer people are paying less for fares and actually tapping their card every time than to try and jack up the price of actually riding the train in the first place.
Sure, if you only have a certain amount of money on your Orca card, you might be a little more judicious with when you need it or when you use it based on how long you're going to have to use that Orca card to get through. Interesting. It actually sounds like they need more of a psychologist than an advertising agency here.
Right. Yeah, right. Yeah, Peter Rogoff he launched into this anecdotal story that was, he talked about people going to a Mariners game where they spend, $60 on the tickets to the baseball game, and they buy a $13 beer and a $10 hot dog, and then as they're leaving the stadium and getting on light rail, they skip their $2.50 transit fare. So, I think for some kind of transit advocates, that focus on kind of personal responsibility is a little frustrating, actually. They'd like to see the message be more about transit access more broadly and kind of getting to the psychology of why people may or may not be paying. But as it stands right now, Rogoff is clearly frustrated with Sound Transit riders at this point.
Let's take a look at the bigger picture here, David. Sound Transit has big expansion plans. They owe voters new light rail stops as far south as Tacoma and as far north as Everett. That has already been pared back. Could farebox trouble mean less service here?
Yeah, there's no plan for that right now. They are not saying that these farebox troubles are going to result in, less service at least at the current moment, or a slower expansion. But, I think it fits into a sort of larger angst at Sound Transit because they're also dealing with the fact that doing these expansions is going to cost $3 billion more than they expected through 2046. Like basically every industry, they're struggling with worker shortages, labor costs and, supply chain issues. And there is a concrete worker strike going on. So they are not getting any concrete as it is. So they have a lot of problems that they're trying to deal with. And I think this, as of right now, is perhaps not existential, but it's another straw on the camel's back.
Seattle Times transportation reporter David Kroman, really good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. Jason Pagano produced today's show. Matt Jorgensen does our theme music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.